Okay guys, so I'm going to talk to you about the Principles of Design project. So you've read through the slides, hopefully you've seen the Principles of Design, you've seen the section about how you're going to design a character. I really struggled with how to show you examples for this project because on the one hand, I didn't want to just show you like a full set of examples and then you could just take out my character and plug in your own character. But I did want to give you enough information that you can kind of like get a feel for what you're supposed to be doing. So I made a few examples and I created just a really simple stick figure character. You should not do this. You should create an actual developed character as mentioned in the slides. But I created just a simple character so I could illustrate a couple of the principles for you so you can kind of see what you're supposed to be doing. So in this one, I illustrated balance. So this would be symmetrical balance. So if you were to divide it down the middle here, it's pretty much the same on both sides, but I intentionally included a few differences. So like I've got a flower here versus a heart here. The trees are not exactly the same, but this still is symmetrical balance because you have the same like shapes on each side, even if there are slight differences. Then this is the one that I created for contrast. So I've got like black on white versus white on black, and that creates a strong contrast. People sometimes ask me what is the difference between contrast and variety because they're both about differences, right? Contrast usually indicates a very, very strong difference. So like maybe even as far as opposites like black and white, or opposites as in complementary colors like red and green, or something maybe that's really, really small versus something that's really, really large. Whereas variety can be just more like slight differences. It doesn't have to be like polar opposites like contrast does. And contrast doesn't have to be complete opposites. Like I could have done this with maybe replace the white with like a light gray and the black with a dark gray, and it still would have read as contrast. But contrast, they need to be very different, whereas variety, they don't necessarily have to be very different. Which brings me to variety. So in this one, I've got my original stick man, but then I've also got a whole bunch of other stick men as well in a variety of poses versus unity, where I have the exact same stick man over and over again. So this is what I talked about in the Google Slides. This is kind of boring to look at. Like nobody would look at a piece of art. Well, I mean, this is just stickmen, but even if this was, you know, not stickmen, people probably wouldn't look at this a ton. Whereas this is sometimes so chaotic that people don't want to look at it. So when these two combine, that's when you would have harmony. The principles of design are never intended really to be used alone. So even just separating them to put them on separate index cards can sometimes be a little bit strange. And a lot of times you will find that there's a lot of overlap. So like your contrast may also represent emphasis, or your movement may also represent rhythm. But I do want you to come up with an illustration for each one, even if there is some overlap. So if your movement represents movement but also represents rhythm, you still have to do a separate card for rhythm. You can't combine them down into like 3 cards. But anyway, so usually you wouldn't separate them out like this, but just for the purposes of learning about them, I do want you to do your best to separate them out. But then think of some ways, especially for harmony, where how you could kind of combine these two ideas into one. So some examples would be maybe you keep them all the same like size, but then you do the variety of poses. It could be that maybe you you do something more like this, but then you use colors as unity, and then the variety here plus the unity of the colors creates harmony. So harmony is really when unity and variety work together to make something that is interesting to look at. So those are the 4 examples that I have to show you. As you are working, if you've done maybe like 3 or 4 and then you get to rhythm and you're having a really hard time thinking of what you want to do, if you are on site, just come and talk to me and show me the cards that you have made. If you are virtual, you can send me just a picture of these are the 4 cards that I have. I'm having a really hard time coming up with something for rhythm. Can you help me? And I can usually help you come up with a starting place of an idea that you can move forward with. And if you have any other questions while you're working on this, please feel free to let me know. Go back and reference the Google Slides often as you are coming up with things, and just Google. So like if you're trying to think of like, how do I show movement in art, Google movement in art or movement principles of design. And you can usually find some examples to kind of get in your brain what you're supposed to be doing. that you can then adapt into the character that you're coming up with. I don't want you to just copy something that you're finding on the internet, but if you need to look at 5 or 6 examples to get a better idea of what you're supposed to be creating, that's totally fine. But as always, send me an email if you need anything from me.